Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber CRISP Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. Monitoring controls is not a one-time task. In other words, controls must be evaluated repeatedly over time. Controls are not set-and-forget mechanisms. They degrade, get bypassed, or become obsolete due to change in systems, processes, or threats. In other words, what worked last year may no longer be effective. Ongoing monitoring helps confirm that controls continue to operate as intended and remain aligned with risk appetite. In other words, they still do what they were designed to do. Without monitoring, silent failures accumulate, reducing organizational protection without immediate warning. In other words, risk increases invisibly. Regular control monitoring supports compliance, reduces audit exposure, and gives early warning of emerging issues. In other words, it keeps the system honest and responsive. C-risk professionals must not only implement controls, they must connect monitoring results to business performance and risk posture. In other words, monitoring supports strategic awareness. On the exam, answers that show control awareness without action will usually be incomplete. In other words, knowing isn't enough. Responding is required. Look for responses that connect monitoring to insight and insight to improvement. In other words, data should drive iteration. Effective control monitoring starts with identifying what matters most. In other words, don't monitor everything, monitor what drives assurance. Execution consistency is key. Is the control applied the same way every time by every user or system? In other words, does it work consistently in practice? Failure rate matters. How often does the control miss its target or trigger incorrectly? In other words, are errors common or rare? Coverage is also critical. Does the control apply to all relevant assets, processes, or scenarios? In other words, is anything left out? Monitoring must also consider the effect of change. If systems or business processes evolve, controls may degrade silently. In other words, change without review leads to risk. Use metrics aligned to the control's role, type, and risk criticality. In other words, tailor measures to what the control protects. On the exam, expect questions about how to assess whether a control is working broadly, not just whether it exists. In other words, the exam rewards function over form. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Control monitoring involves both automated and manual techniques. In other words, it takes multiple methods to ensure confidence. Automated logs and alerts are useful for technical controls such as login attempts, firewall activity, or file access. In other words, they catch events as they happen. Manual reviews include periodic review of approvals, policy attestations, and management oversight of non-automated tasks. In other words, human judgment supplements automation. Reperformance is valuable for transaction-based controls. Repeat a sample of the control activity to ensure it works as expected. In other words, confirm it through reenactment. Dashboards that display key control indicators help summarize exceptions and trends for both technical and executive audiences. In other words, visualization helps everyone understand what's happening. The goal is systematic, continuous monitoring, not reactive action only after failure occurs. In other words, stay ahead, don't catch up. Key control indicators, or KCIs, are metrics that show how well controls are performing. In other words, KCIs help gauge control health over time. A KCI might show the percentage of controls tested with no issues, the number of exceptions logged per month, or the average time to fix a failed control. In other words, they convert control status into measurable signals. Each KCI must have a threshold. When performance falls below this point, response is required. In other words, make metrics actionable. Ownership is also essential. Someone must be accountable for watching the indicator and taking action. In other words, numbers need names. If a control failed silently for months, that usually points to missing or poorly defined KCIs. In other words, absence of signals equals absence of awareness. On the exam, choose answers that include specific indicators, defined thresholds, and assigned owners. In other words, look for accountability in design. Controls should be treated as living processes. In other words, improvement must be continuous, not reactive. The improvement cycle starts with monitoring, reviewing how controls behave in daily operations, in other words, observe their real performance. Next is analysis. What failed, why did it fail, and what feedback was received. In other words, investigate the root cause. Then redesign or update the control's design, implementation, or configuration. In other words, refine based on lessons. Follow that with retesting and validation to confirm the updated control performs as intended. In other words, test after fixing. Finally, document the changes and communicate updates to affected teams and governance groups. In other words, close the loop with clarity. In C-risk scenarios, the best answers reflect this full loop, not just detection, but response and iteration. In other words, maturity means follow through. Improvement comes from feedback. In other words, listen to your systems and your users. Sources include control testing results, which often highlight failure patterns or recurring weak spots. In other words, tests reveal what doesn't work. Incident reports and root cause analysis reveal whether controls were absent, failed, or misused. In other words, postmortems expose flaws. Audit findings expose compliance gaps, documentation errors, or outdated implementations. In other words, they show where process and execution misalign. User feedback may show where controls interfere with workflows or create frustration. In other words, design may conflict with usability. The best improvements come when all these sources are reviewed together and translated into design changes or new monitoring goals. In other words, feedback fuels evolution. Controls must be updated when the environment changes. In other words, static controls fall behind. Business changes, such as new products, processes, or partners, may render old controls ineffective. In other words, growth can outpace governance. Technology changes, like moving to cloud platforms or integrating AI, introduce new threats and control needs. In other words, innovation shifts the landscape. Regulatory updates or industry shifts may also affect what is required or expected. In other words, rules change and so must your controls. Periodic control reviews help ensure ongoing alignment. In other words, schedule keeps pace. On the exam, if a control has not been reviewed after major change, expect that to be flagged as a failure of adaptation. In other words, rigidity is risk. Control rationalization is the process of reviewing your control environment for efficiency. In other words, more is not always better. Start by identifying redundant controls, 2 or more that perform the same task. In other words, consolidate for clarity, combine overlapping functions where possible, and retire controls that no longer serve a purpose. In other words, streamline and simplify. Rationalization reduces burden on users, improves performance, and clarifies responsibility. In other words, it frees up time and avoids confusion. Align rationalization with updates to the risk register, frameworks, and process maps. In other words, changes must be reflected in governance tools. In C-risk scenarios, when controls seem excessive or misaligned, rationalization is the path to efficiency. In other words, less is sometimes more. Monitoring should feed governance. In other words, report results and drive awareness. Internal committees, compliance teams, or executives must receive regular updates on control health. In other words, leadership needs control visibility. Track performance over time, look for trends, improvements, or areas that need review. In other words, trend lines tell stories. Escalate repeated failures, unresolved exceptions, or non-responsive control owners. In other words, silence requires a response. Use dashboards, metric scorecards, and written summaries tailored to the audience. In other words, match message to reader. C-risk questions often test how to communicate performance to different stakeholders. In other words, reporting must be both clear and targeted. C-risk exam questions about control monitoring and improvement often follow the same patterns. In other words, common scenarios test familiar themes. You may be asked which control should be reviewed. Look for those that are stale, failing, or not aligned to current risks. In other words, age, outcome, and fit guide selection. If asked which metric to use, pick one that measures coverage, reliability, or effectiveness. In other words, don't pick generic data. When a control is failing, determine whether it is outdated, poorly designed, or simply not monitored. In other words, root cause explains the result. After spotting a trend, the right next step is usually improvement, testing, and communication. In other words, act with purpose. The best answers show iteration, visibility, accountability, and business alignment. In other words, maturity lives in the loop. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cyber Risk Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.